Hello again. This is Mr. Blake and continuing the chapter reviews for mastering the AP exam that we were having on May 5th, Cinco de Mayo. We are coming towards the end. We are now looking at two chapters here, which is development and industry. And since they're so interrelated, I taught them as one big thing. So this would, I believe, be chapters 10 and 11, I believe. Okay, so industry and development. We're leaning back and picking up some of this demographic stuff that we talked about earlier, because when we go through development, demographics are impacted as countries begin to develop. So I'll be touching on those again, as well as some other new acronyms that you're going to need to remember that we've been referring to through much of the year. Things like MDCs and LDCs. MDCs are your more developed countries. LDCs are your less developed countries. They can also be divided into core, periphery, and semi periphery. Core being the developed countries, often the post industrial societies. The semi periphery are the newly industrialized states like Brazil and China. And then you have the developing world, which are the periphery states. And remember the role that each one of these plays in a modern globalized society. The MDCs often produce the high tech goods or the finished goods. The semi periphery, newly industrial states are often very export oriented. They have just recently industrialized, so they often have low cost labor as well as the ability to export. And so that's their role in globalized society. This is often where we will offshore jobs and offshore factories, for instance. And then you have the periphery, which are the developing countries that often provide the raw materials so that those goods can be made. And so there's a relationship between all these different layers of global industry. Either they're making goods or they're providing the raw materials, and that's the relationship. When we're looking at the development of countries, we are probably looking at a couple of things. We may be looking at things like GDP, gross domestic product. More likely, what you'll see questions about is GNI, gross national income. Which is maybe a little better way to look to see what's the quality of life, maybe because in that you're doing it per capita and you're looking at everything that's taking place inside the economy and then dividing it up amongst that population. And you can get a kind of a better feel for maybe how much money is sloshing around in that economy and how well people may be having access to goods and services in it. HDI is the Human Development Index. This is how the UN ranks countries depending on what the quality of life is in different countries. And that is based on do you have access to infrastructure? How many calories do you take in? What sort of communications technology do you have access to? What's your education levels? And so on and so forth. You may be looking at PPP, which is purchasing power parity, which means how much stuff can you buy with the same dollar. And you may have noticed that in different countries, you can buy different amounts of stuff. Something that may be like a full course meal in one country for $15 is barely going to get your family fed at the local Burger King. And so, depending on where you are, the dollars that you have in your pocket may be able to purchase you more stuff. So keeping PPP in mind, that might be something that you would see. Other big things, remember the sectors of society. When you're looking at economic activity levels, think about primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary, quinary. Primary being mostly agriculture, mining, raw material extraction. You see more of this in LDCs than MDCs. If you're looking at secondary, that's the manufacturing. You're taking raw materials, making it into stuff. And you see this as when countries begin to develop. That's the reason why people are migrating into the cities. That's where the factories are. And so you have those factory jobs. So when you see countries turning to becoming developing, they're starting to move into that secondary level. Now, your semi-periphery states, probably a good half of their population may be involved in industry, that they're making stuff in factories. They have newly industrialized, and so they have a lot of people involved in secondary as well as probably still in primary, feeding those folks in the cities. So you're going to see them spread in a developed to primary and secondary. And then from there, once they've developed and become industrialized, they start moving into tertiary. And tertiary is all the sales and services. So you're not necessarily making goods, you're probably selling those goods, or you're selling some sort of professional service that you offer as a dentist, as a car salesman, as an insurance salesman, as selling jewelry at the mall. All of this stuff would be considered tertiary. And once you have a whole bunch of people living in cities and not so much in farms anymore, you're going to need those services jobs out there to support those people in the city. When you become post industrial, you're going to see more and more people moving into the development and the creative end of the economy. This is the quaternary level, and you need very educated people to do it. You need to have the technology to do it. You need the telecommunications to be able to do it. This is the realm of information systems, information technology, research and development in any field that you can think of. If they're working with new stuff, they are at the quaternary level. And so all your mad scientists, your pharmaceutical researchers, all that stuff, as well as the arts, poets and artists and actors and singers and stuff, all fit into that category because they're making new stuff, or they are expanding our knowledge of stuff. So that's quaternary. Also post-industrial, and to a very limited extent in other societies, where you'll have that quinary. And quinary are the decision makers. And often these are very powerful individuals in industries, in businesses, in governments, that make decisions that affect all the lives of everybody else. And so think about big CEOs of big corporations. Most of these are going to be located in MDCs. In many cases, there aren't a whole lot in the LDCs at all. But in quinary, you're looking at the big heads of companies again, government officials. Most people that work in government perhaps would fit into this category as far as making laws or enforcing laws. Presidents, prime ministers, parliaments, all that stuff fits into that category. People that make big decisions. One thing that is kind of weird, because I get asked this a lot, is the where does sports fit into this? And that's entertainment. And it's considered quaternary because as many times as you might watch a football game, it's never the same game played on on different days. The outcome could be different. It's all going to be different, and therefore it's considered quaternary. So, in case you ever have a sports question, now you know. All right, think about the impact all of this in development has to do on demographics. Remember, one of our big migrations is going from rural to cities. And that is triggered when countries begin to industrialize. They move there because that's where the jobs are. And as soon as you move into the cities, your demographic tools start to change. Life expectancy goes up, literacy goes up, your infant mortality starts going down. So remember, as we go through these stages, as more and more people are employed in different fields, that means that their demographics probably change too. So in a developing country, there's a big population spike because your kids are surviving, people are living longer. When you hit that industrialized state, you start seeing the fertility rate drop. So most of your semi-peripheries, their populations have either gone to about zero population growth, or they may actually start shrinking. By the time you get to the post-industrials, your population is probably shrinking. You've gone into negative population growth, not because your babies are dying or anything. Most of them aren't. The problem is that you have a lot of old people. Old people don't have kids, and you're not having as many kids because everybody's living in the cities. And children, you don't need a whole bunch of them in the city. They're an expense in the city. You can't put them into farm work and stuff. So your fertility rate drops below 2.1, and that means that most likely your country's gone into negative population growth. It's shrinking. So again, think about as countries develop, what's the impact on the human population? What's happening with all those demographic changes? And just because it's fun to think about what's happening to that culture too, as you bring people out of rural traditional societies into urban societies where they're encountering all sorts of people. We're moving from traditional to pop culture. Think about how that might impact gender issues, going from traditional gender roles to a more urbanized, shall we say, modern gender roles. That sometimes that creates conflicts as women move into the workforce, for instance, when they're expected to stay at home and raise kids. Things like that when you're looking at development. Keep that in mind. Think about where our developed and undeveloped regions are. Most of your MDCs are in the Northern Hemisphere, specifically North America, Europe, Japan, South Korea, places like that. Your semi periphery are things like Russia, China. Some of your Middle Eastern countries fit into this sort of. Looking at Brazil, South Africa, more recently, places like Malaysia, Indonesia are now fitting into this, India, Pakistan. And then you have your developing world, which is going to be your LDCs. Most of that is going to be sub Saharan Africa, parts of Latin America, parts of Southern Asia, where the countries are still developing and in many cases may not be very far along that road. So, again, think in regions. Where would you find the big industrial countries, the post industrial societies, and the LDCs, the less developed countries? Always remember the Rostow model because we're dealing with what? Industry, right? So when you're looking at Rostow, think about factory production. Where are you going to want to put your factory? You did a whole project on this. So think about all the elements that you had to think of to place your factory. Where was your markets? Where are your raw materials coming from? Transportation costs, labor costs, energy costs, all that stuff. Weber, when you're looking at Weber, and did I say Rostow? I said Rostow, didn't I? It was Weber I was trying to refer to there. When you're looking at Weber, think about all those elements of where you would locate a factory. And in most cases, you're probably locating it out on the outskirts of a city where you have access to maybe cheap land, cheap power. You have a labor force that is educated enough to work in your factory, but maybe in a region in a country that doesn't have unions and things where maybe the labor costs are higher. You're having to make all those decisions. So keep that in mind. Now, getting to Rostow, because that was the next thing on my list. In Rostow, you are looking at the development of a country, going from traditional agrarian society, that's stage one. Stage two, they build the infrastructure to support what will become industries. Usually that takes place in and around cities, and this is the development of roads and water systems and sewer systems and power systems and stuff like that. Stage three is takeoff. That is when the country begins to industrialize and there's a wave of migrants into the cities to work into the factories. So, this is factory production in basic industries like steel production, textiles, heavy machinery, usually things that a business is making really for another business. So the machinery is for other businesses to do what it is that they need to do. Think about this is probably when we're going to start building harvesters for farmers and stuff so they can be more productive making food with machines and things. When you get to stage four, that is when the ideas in Rostow begin to spread to other industries. So think about pottery. Up to this point, pottery was done by hand and stuff. Well, now we can make it in a factory setting. So the idea of making pots is now spreading to another industry rather than those core industries. And then finally, at stage five, we're making consumer goods. That we're no longer so much making stuff for maybe some other business or finishing or making a raw material more finished, like iron ore to steel. We're now making things like washing machines. We're making dryers. We're making dishwashers. We're making refrigerators. So these are factories making consumer goods, and that is that last stage. That is where we have a consumer society. And when you have your industry making goods for individual customers, you are looking at an industrialized state. And so that is the determination that we make now to figure out whether a country is industrialized or not. Has it reached that stage in the Rostow model? So that's what Rostow was all about. I'm sorry I was swapping names out there. Remember the international trade model versus the self sufficiency model. If you're a developing country, how do you want to develop? Are you going to try to do it on your own with your own resources? Or are you going to go out there and find people or governments to loan you money in order to do the development? And there's pluses and minuses going both ways. If you're going the international trade route or the international finance route, yes, you'll have access to money, and that will be able you can spend that money to build your infrastructure and build your industries and whatnot, but there's a cost. That's usually loan money, and because you're considered poor, especially as a poor LDC, you're considered a risk, and so you're going to be paying a lot of interest on those loans. And many times countries find out that they can't actually pay back their loans, and they end up going through essentially bankruptcy. Another problem is that if you owe that nation or that bank or that individual that money, the chances are that they are going to have some say into how you spend that money. And it may well be that the factory that you're building, they want a cut of its profits. And so maybe the money is not actually going to stay in your country. It's going to go somewhere else. Developing that mine that you found that has nickel or titanium or something that the rest of the world wants, yeah, they'll help you finance it, but they want a cut of it. So your money isn't going to stay in the country. Another issue is they're going to focus on things that they can make money at really, really fast. And that may not be what you want for your country. That those sectors, the mining sector will grow because they're investing in that. But you want these other sectors to grow, and there's no money getting to you for that. So you may not be growing exactly the sectors that you want to grow if you're going with you're getting your funding from somewhere else. Now the self-sufficiency model, the problem being is you're already a poor country, right? You probably don't have a whole lot of money to invest in yourself, and so what little you have to be kind of fairly careful about. It's probably going to be not as large scale. It's probably going to take more time to develop these things because you have limited resources to do it. One thing that we do see is if you're trying to do the self sufficiency, you can spread that out in your economy. That if you're trying to grow different sectors of your economy, even though those might not be seen as particularly money making or anything, you may choose to invest in that one because it will help employ people maybe in that part of that country, of your country, or try to get certain people employed in that business, even though it may not be making a whole lot of money. And the idea here is the more people that you can get working and employed, they're making paychecks, they're spending those paychecks, you got more money in circulation in your economy, and that money then will build these businesses up over time. There is a potential for corruption on the self sufficiency model because you're not answerable to anybody either. And so it's possible some of that money will disappear. It often happens. But think about those two models. They often come up as a question, certainly in multiple choice. It may well be a pretty good essay question, too. So you might want to look those over, make sure you can kind of see the aspects of both. What are the positives? What are the negatives for both? Think about, since I made mention of the international finance, know things like the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization. These are multinational organizations in many cases that are somehow connected to development money, for instance. So, for instance, the World Bank is a group that often finance infrastructure projects and economic development in developing countries. These are MDCs for the most part, that are contributing the money into the World Bank, and then the World Bank will then put that money out into the LDCs to help them finance these sorts of things. Now, the thing with the World Bank is they often will consider many LDCs a bad risk, and they won't give them any money. There's only a few, mostly Latin American countries, that actually get money that way. Others are going to have to find some other finance, either through banks or some other mechanism. The World Trade Organization is a group that is advocating free trade amongst nations. So, one of the things that they try to do is to get everybody to join, and then they can set the rules as to how trade will be done between these different countries. And their big goal is to open up trade across the globe, with the idea that the more that we trade, the more money changes in hands, the more goods that are put out there, the better off everybody is economically, and all countries can grow then. They are a big advocate of free trade. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, is a group that steps in when countries, shall we say, can't pay their bills. That maybe they took out loan money, but for whatever reason, they're not paying their bills on time. And as a country, again, you might get the knock on the door from the IMF, and they're going to come there and tell you, okay, you owe all this money, you're going to pay it back now, and this is how you're going to do it. And so often this means that the IMF will tell the country that they've got to cut back on the number of people in government employment, for instance. You're going to have to cut staff. Because all those paychecks that money could be going to paying for your loans. If you have state-owned enterprises or state-owned land, you're probably going to have to sell it off, and the proceeds of that sale are going to go to pay off your loans. So it may well be that I've got public land that my country owns, and I've got to sell it off to developers, and that money then goes into the coffers of the IMF, who then pass it on to whoever I own money to. In the past, they have taken over port facilities, they've taken over post offices, and everything else, anything that they could possibly squeeze some money out of. The IMF is not popular in the developing world because they have often come in and imposed what is referred to as austerity measures, and that austerity is cutting government spending to the bone. That often teachers will be fired, or they'll have their pay cut in half, because we make up a lot of the public sector workers. You can imagine that if you were in a country where austerity has been imposed, there's going to be lots of folks that are not happy. If you are an old person living on a state pension, and the IMF comes in and tells you that your pension is only going to be half the amount, by the way, that's probably going to make a whole lot of old people unhappy. So, what we often see in countries where austerity has been put into place is that there are often civil unrest. There's riots in the streets and everything else, protesting these austerity reforms. They're often referred to, that the government has done because the IMF is telling them this is what you have to do. So, there's the joy of international finance and banking. Think about your basic industries. When countries begin the industrialization process, they will get usually involved in things like steel production, basic canning of foods, textiles, things like that. Uh, some of which they will be able, in the modern world, to export and make money. But often these are the very first industries that you go into. Bangladesh is a pretty good example of a recently developing country that got very into textiles production. They're now one of the largest producers of textiles in the world, for instance. Think about your types of factories. Fordist versus post-Fordist. Fordist is the assembly line that you think of whenever you think of factories and goods being produced, like cars and stuff. That image that you have, that's the Fordist model. It is a top-down, labor-intensive form of industry. There's a lot of people doing stuff, but they're often doing very simple jobs, repetitive jobs. So they don't need a great deal of education to do it, but they need some. In a post-Fordist, everybody learns everybody else's jobs. It's not so much a moving assembly line. It can be done in pods. And there's a lot of conversation going on up and down. This is where a lot of new ideas come from the shop floor, where workers who are actually making this stuff up come up with a better idea of how to do it, or maybe even a new product altogether, because it'll be better than what we make. And so a lot of industries are moving towards this post Fordist model um, to produce their goods. So there's those two different kinds. Keep those in mind. Think about your energy sources as a developing country or as a country that has industries. You need to know what your energy options are. So you have your fossil fuels like gas and coal and oil. Then these are considered non-renewables. We're not making more of that stuff. You have nuclear, which is using the power of the atom. Which has its pros and cons. It's a great source of energy, but you also have this little problem of radioactive material that you have to do something with. We haven't quite figured that one out. You have your inexhaustibles, things like solar power, wind power, tidal power, where a lot of countries are moving to these because they tend to be non polluting and it's an inexhaustible source of energy. We will be able to have that forever. You also have things like hydroelectric, where you're tapping the power of running water through like rivers and things. That is considered a renewable, presuming that you still have water flowing through the river. Um, so think about power sources and how that may impact where factories might be located. Remember your bulk producing or bulk increasing, bulk decreasing in industry. You had to figure that out in Weber too. Do you need to be closer to your resources? Do you need to be closer to your markets? So think about industries that do both. How many of them have a lot of waste material in the production of whatever it is in their factory? That means they're probably bulk decreasing. If they're bulk increasing, they're probably adding stuff to it or it's changing shape. And if that's the case, then they're probably a bulk increasing and you'd want to be closer to your markets then. Makes sense? Good. I hope so. Uh, what else? There's a lot of stuff that goes on involved in this one. This is where micro lending came in when we were looking at developing the small scale loans in LDCs, especially very poor LDCs, that you're going to give small loans to the poorest people of that country in order to start up their own businesses, especially cottage industries where they can hand make something and sell it in the market and make money for themselves. This is another gender issue thing because most of those loans go to women because they are often the poorest of the poor in these countries. And so if you want to get that money there, uh, injected into the economy where it'll do the most good, that's where it's going to be. And so this is one of these sources in places like sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia, where women who often had no control over their own finances because they've been able to build these businesses are now self-sufficient money-wise. And that has changed their relationship with the male population in those countries, that they are no longer dependent on men. They can make their own decisions. And again, that may have consequences in societies. The men may not take that idea very kindly. And so consider this is a gender issue in economics. The idea of micro lending, micro loans, micro entrepreneurship, and so forth. Something to keep in mind. Other issues, the idea of the International Division of Labor. And that goes back again to this post industrial periphery, semi periphery core. What do people do as jobs around the world? And in your MDCs, again, that's mostly sales and services, tertiary designing new things, and often making the decisions on a global basis. If you're looking at the semi periphery, that's where a lot of the offshoring jobs in industry have gone to. They have a lower cost of labor and they have an educated workforce to work in factories. So the semi periphery are industrialized and they are often export oriented. They're selling goods all over the world, especially to the MDCs, the cores. And when you look at the LDCs, this is often where farming is still being done, especially plantation agriculture, where they can sell goods to MDCs like coffee or tea or chocolate or whatever. But this is also the source of raw materials for those industries in the semi periphery and the MDCs. So There's a division of labor that tends to be intensive, very low cost, often farming. So think about how much people would be paid in these different areas, what kind of jobs that they would do around the world. Think about, again, offshoring. That's the movement of industrial jobs to overseas to take advantage of lower cost labor, maybe less regulations and things. This creates areas like the Rust Belt, or what I've seen recently referred to as the brown lands. And these are areas that used to be industrialized, and the industries have moved away. Either to some other region of the country or overseas. And so these become areas of high unemployment. The factories have shut down, nothing has really replaced those occupations. Often the populations begin to go down as people move somewhere else where the jobs are. And so these are areas that are often poverty stricken, high unemployment. The Ohio Valley in the United States is a pretty good example of this, where that used to be our industrial core in the United States, and it has moved somewhere else, maybe Mexico, maybe China, maybe the southern states of the United States. And so there's high unemployment, a lot of people leaving places like Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania and Indiana because there's no jobs there and they need to go somewhere else. So that's the impact sometimes of offshoring or the movement of factories to somewhere else. Think about agglomeration of industry, where you have factories set up close by to each other because they can take advantage of the same raw materials or the same labor force that have similar skills. And so you have a bunch of companies that'll exist in the same area, in the same industry, and they can kind of share ideas and concepts. In a weird way, Silicon Valley is kind of like that. And think about where all those computer companies set up originally, either making computer parts or computers themselves. They all kind of sat together because they could exchange those things easily. The workforce was skilled in these particular things. Same thing with the auto industry in and around Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Pennsylvania. You had a lot of car factories set up in the same place because they could share the same workforce. They had the same access towards resources and things like that. Also, talking about the car industry, single market industries. Again, think about my company that made headlights. I want to set up where I have access to the big car manufacturing plants. And if they're all in this area, that means I want to set up my factory there too, because I want to supply them with tens and hundreds of thousands of headlights. That's how I'm going to make my money. Now, that means that I'm very dependent on keeping those guys happy. And so I want to be close by. So in case they need something, I can get it to them ASAP, which then also starts getting into things like just in time delivery and stuff that we talked about. This in industry too, didn't we? Just in time means that in the modern factory, I don't keep a lot of spare parts. I keep just enough maybe to get me through one day or one week or something like that. And because we have computer technology, my computers can order exactly what I'm going to need over the next couple of days or the day. So when I start up in the morning, let's say I have almost nothing left as far as spare parts, but lo and behold, here comes a new shipment of those parts. I am never going to be out of them, is the idea, but I also don't have to store them either. And that's the whole beauty of the just-in-time model, is because we have this computer and telecommunications technology, we can have the computers making all the orders for parts or resources that we need to make our stuff. The problem is if anything goes wrong in that system, then suddenly we completely run out of parts. So you guys have seen this for the last couple of years, that we don't have enough computer chips to go around to all the industries because they were all shut down because of COVID. And if the factories aren't making chips, then all the businesses that are dependent on computer chips can't get the chips because they didn't have any stacked up anywhere. They ran out of them, 2 years ago. And so what's left out there is of high value. The cost of those things have gone up, and it's going to be that way until who knows. We watched the whole just-in-time globalized system kind of come to a failure over the last couple of years, and so you have been on the front row seat of that. Remember your closed shop versus right to work. If you're looking at unions versus non-unions, if you're a closed shop state, you have laws that protect unionism or the formations of unions or what unions can do. That often means higher labor costs because the unions are going to advocate for higher pay and better benefits and things like that. And of course, that's going to get passed on by whoever the industry is. In a right to work state, they often have laws that prevent unionization or they limit the powers of the unions, which means that generally labor costs are lower. Productivity is considered higher because it doesn't take as much to make whatever it is. The downside being is that often the pay is lower, and so these workers may not have as high a pay or as good of benefits. Big division in the United States would be the northern and the southern states. Northern states tend to be closed shop states. Southern states tend to be right to work states, and that means that a lot of the factories that used to exist in the north move south because lower labor costs. Let's see. Industrial Revolution. You got to know what the Industrial Revolution was. This is the beginning of the mechanization, the creation of the factory system. Begins in England, spreads very rapidly through Western Europe. Eventually, it spreads to Northern America, the New England states, and into the Ohio Valley. And currently, it is still spreading around the world. But you got to know a little bit of the history of the Industrial Revolution. It may come up as a question. You might want to know something about vertical integration of industry. This would be the idea that a company controls all the levels that it needs to produce, distribute, and sell a particular good or whatever. The easiest way to think about this is think about Exxon. You're aware of the oil company? Exxon Oil owns the areas where they drill oil. They extract the oil. They send it to an Exxon refinery where they turn it into gasoline. They put it on Exxon trucks that take it to Exxon gas stations where they sell Exxon gasoline to you. Exxon controls every aspect of that movement of that good to you, from where the raw materials are to its factory production to its distribution. That is a vertically integrated industry. If it's horizontally integrated, it means it's in a whole bunch of different industries, doing all sorts of different things. Mitsubishi or Sony are pretty good examples of these kind of companies where they make all sorts of different things. Samsung is another example. They make refrigerators and televisions and VCRs and CDs and planes and cars and whatever else, rocket ships, who knows. But they make all these different things all under the one company. That is horizontal integration. Vertical is they control all the bits to make that thing. I think that that is probably enough for industry. There are other things to consider, like pollution, industrial pollution, but you've probably got a pretty good grasp of that already. So I'm going to conclude industry and development and move on to our last services and cities.